Welcome back to the second session of this morning. And for this, I have the pleasure to welcome here Maria de Cillis, Dr. Maria de Cillis, welcoming her back, in actual fact, to SOAS, because she spent many a year here doing an MA and then a PhD thesis, which is the basis of her current study on subjects related to Islamic philosophy, Ismaili theology, and Shiite studies. There's a book by her which has been on sale, and some have bought it already, entitled Free Will and Predestination in Islamic Thought, Theoretical Compromises in the Works of Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Arabi. And this is also a topic which Maria de Cillis will take further in her presentation now. Thank you very much.
Would like to thank you, everybody who is here, and of course Richard and the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society for hosting me, SOAS, and Stefan for his nice introduction. So today in my brief presentation to you, I will try to delineate as much as possible Ibn Arabi's stance on issues like qada and qadar, so the understanding of divine decree, predestination, and destiny. In the study that has been mentioned, I've attempted to demonstrate, I don't know to what extent successfully or not, that pivotal intellectuals like Ibn Sina, so known in the Western world as Avicenna, and Al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi, attempted to provide a form of a harmonization or theoretical compromises in their systems of thought. And my conclusions were that whether on the one hand Avicenna and Ghazali were probably dictated to reach these compromising stances in order probably to please the authorities. In particular, Al-Ghazali found himself, especially in the first part of his career, willing to please the triumphant Ash'arism of the 11th and 12th century. In the case of Ibn Arabi, in Ibn Arabi's thought, this conciliation, let's say, between philosophical, theological, when I'm speaking about theological, I'm speaking about the kalamic stances, so kalam, speculative theologians, the mutakallimun stances, and the mystical parameters seemed to have served the scope of simply better convey his experience, his understanding, his experiential taste of the reality rather than pleasing the authorities. And in a way, the nature of Ibn Arabi's writings is a testimony to this tendency. We all know that his works have been defined as serpentine works, characterized by perplexities and so on, and probably because they were meant to be understood, to be perceived by minds already trained in the Sufis concept, with Sufis concept. But I believe that these bewildering paradoxes and these juxtapositions, let's say, of, on the one hand, more orthodox and unorthodox dictates and unorthodox positions, were meant to abolish the conventional parameters of languages, the conventional parameters of expressions, had they been mystical, had they been philosophical, had they been characterized by kalamic positions. So Ibn Arabi is really a non-conceptual language. And his use of philosophical idioms, of kalamic idioms, of course, mystical language, mystical terminology, was just used as a lingua franca, so a kind of vernacular parlance, a way of introducing and expressing and conveying in the best possible way his very subjective, his very evanescent, in a way, experience of the reality. Now, it has been stated by many scholars, it has been to a certain extent demonstrated that Ibn Arabi's thought was very much influenced by the Neoplatonic thought. And there has been also tendency to trying to categorize in a certain way, trying to place Ibn Arabi's position within a very coherent speculative form of thought. Some people, some scholars, some intellectuals have defined his findings as being characteristic of a mystical philosophy or a philosophical mysticism. But I believe that in the end, this kind of categorizing tendency, this kind of attitude of willing to impose a form of structure to the Ibn Arabi's thought, it's really meant to fail. His understanding, his subjective view of the reality, his way of living the real, of living God, is really dictated by divine insights. So I think what characterizes Ibn Arabi's thought is a spirit of intellectual tolerance. And this is very visible, it's very clear when Ibn Arabi addresses his disciples in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, but also in other risalas, in some of his risalas, and basically is warning his disciples from any form of clear-cut condemnation of the systems of thought of the mutakallimun or even the falasifa. And this is especially visible when we are dealing with the topics of ethics and metaphysics. After all, Ibn Arabi was very much touched, very much, I would say, interested in how the philosophers had been able, so the Islamic philosopher, the falasifa, had been able to combine and harmonize the system of thought derived from the Greek thought, so this foreign philosophy, within the Islamic paradigm. And Ibn Arabi, to a certain extent, defends the philosophers and their understanding of the hikmah, which he considers to be a synonymous of the knowledge of prophethood. But as also my colleague has talked to you about in a previous discussion, of course, for Ibn Arabi, although the philosophers were able to reach a certain degree of validity, their speculations was up to a certain degree valid, of course, their methodology was not convincing, and these rationalizing speculations really needed to be supported by divine insights. So today I will try to really guide you to some of Ibn Arabi's most peculiar concepts, and I will try to show you how they relate to the theory of the Wahdat al-Wujud on one end, but also I will try to speculate in a way how Ibn Sina's, so Avicenna's understanding of the reality, understanding of the Neoplatonic cosmological system, some of his ideas in a way tiptoed within Ibn Arabi's thought. Ibn Arabi was very much interested and intrigued by Neoplatonism, and I don't know how much you're familiar with the Neoplatonic stances. So Neoplatonism speaks of the reality as a result of the superabundance of God, of a form of effusion of the absolute perfection of God that in a way necessitates the creation of the world without the will of God, the irada of God being pivotal in his decision. So the will of God does not really necessitate the creation. It's just and happening, something that happens naturally because of God's absolute superabundance, absolute perfection. And Ibn Arabi is fascinated by these ideas, and he looks basically at the cosmos as an unraveling of divine perfection. And as we know, he believes that the world is basically a manifestation of the divine presence. And within the divine presence, I believe you all are familiar with the divine attributes, the sifat of God. Ibn Arabi defines the sifat as relative realities, loci theophanici, which means locus of manifestations, of divine self-manifestation. And within the divine presence, within the divine reality, we also have the so-called divine names, so the asma. The definition of the asma is somehow complicated, but is very much related to the understanding of Ibn Arabi's perspective on qada and qadar, so the idea of divine predestination or divine determinism. Now, I would tend to differentiate between these two terms. So on the one hand, I would speak of predestination as almost a theological way of looking at God's omnipotence and the capacity that God has of intervening in each moment in time, directing the destiny, directing the future of anything that exists. So a form of pre-eternal degree that dictates what a certain thing will be and how the future of this certain thing will develop. And this way of looking at the divine decree was very much rooted in the Asherite understanding of God as being absolute omnipotent and able to create both evil acts and good actions. On the other hand, peripatetic philosophers like Ibn Sina, well, Ibn Sina considered himself to be a peripatetic philosopher, so a follower of Aristotle. They believed instead in a form of natural determinism. What does it mean? They believed that the nature of each thing, of each existent, plays a role in the determining of that specific thing's destiny. So when Ibn Arabi speaks of the divine names, he considers them as expressions that detail the undifferentiated divine essence. In themselves are conceptual relations to the essence, which means that they are neither the essence nor different from the being who is designated by them. They are defined as attributions or ascriptions envisaged between God and the cosmos. Now, this is a very important point, and here I will be stressing the similarities with Ibn Sina's thought. Ibn Arabi stresses that in their essential latency, the name's ontological status is in the realm of the possible, the mumkin, between existence and non-existence. Now, the understanding of everything that is around us, that everything that is, as belonging to different categories, in particular to the category of the impossible, of the possible, and of the necessary, is something that characterizes Ibn Sina's, Avicenna's thought. Here I'm just providing an excursus on what are the definitions provided by Ibn Sina on these three categories. So the impossible is something whose impossibility is absolutely necessary in a way. So if we think of something that is impossible, even in our mind, it is impossible for this thing to acquire existence, wujud. The possible of existence, and this is something on which Ibn Arabi's thought is very much keen, is very much similar, is that which could be supposed to be either non-existent or existent without the occurrence of any contradiction. I will go back to the previous slide. When Ibn Arabi speaks of the divine names, he considers them as belonging to the Avicennan category of the mumkin, of the possible being. Everything is but a possibility. Whether this thing is put into existence or is not put into existence. So whether God invests with these things, with wujud, with the attribute, let's say, of wujud, of existence. One of the characteristics of Ibn Sina's thought was the understanding of God, not in Neoplatonic terms. Neoplatonism speaks of God as the one. Ibn Sina speaks of God as the wajib al-wujud, the necessary of existence, which means that for Ibn Sina, God is the only being in which his essence is that, is mahia, and existence are one and the same thing. The two things cannot be detached from each other. God is the only being that necessarily exists by himself. It doesn't need an external cause to create him. It doesn't need an internal cause to create him. Essence and existence are one and the same thing. And it is God, this necessary of existence, that according to Ibn Sina is responsible for the creation of things, is responsible for investing possible beings of creation, of wujud. Now these ideas, although with some subtle differences, are very much present in Ibn Arabi's thought. And this is an extract from the Fusus al-Hikam, where Ibn Arabi says, "It is established that the originated is dependent on which that brings it about for its possibility. Its existence is derived from something harder than itself, the connection in this case being one of dependence. It is therefore necessary that that which is the support of originated existence should be essentially and necessarily by itself, self-sufficient and independent of any other." But this is very much Ibn Sina's understanding of God. And it's a very much philosophical, and I wouldn't say linear, but logical way of looking at what could be a cause in terms of existentiation. Now, when I'm talking about cause and causality, we know that Aristotle used to look at God as the primary cause of, of everything that exists. In Ibn Arabi's thought, this doesn't happen. Ibn Arabi finds extremely problematic to refer to God as a cause. Even his actions cannot be considered as causative of anything in particular, and I will explain to you why, in what terms. Another quotation by Ibn Arabi: "Know that the cosmos is everything other than God, and it is nothing but the possible things. Either they exist or they do not exist. The status of mumkin is inherent in them, either they exist or not." Now, if we consider this stance on the realities, on the fact that everything that exists, everything that is other than God, of course, Ibn Arabi is very clear in differentiating God is God and the things are the things. This is a quotation present in his Futuhat al-Makkiyah. So God is independent, is the independent of the world. There's nothing that we can compare to him. But if we look at everything that is other than God as belonging to the realm of the mumkinat, of the possible things, then it is quite clear, it is quite logical in a way to understand why Ibn Arabi considers all these possible things as being ayan thabita. Are you familiar with this terminology? Ayan thabita is basically a kind of archetype, a kind of unchangeable reality. All the possible beings are invested with the concept of immutability, thubut. He speaks of the immutable entities as eternal archetypes of everything manifested in the cosmos. They designate ideas expressing God's foreknowledge of how his essence will be disclosed in particular instances. They are defined as moments of eternity, determinations, ta'ayunat, perpetually existing ab intra in God's essential unity. Now, the immutable entities play an extraordinary role in the definition, in the understanding of Ibn Arabi's way of looking at the concept of qada and qadar. And I will explain to you in the course of this presentation why. But before that, I would like to create a sort of parallelism between Avicenna's understanding of God's knowledge being a creative knowledge, and in a way, Ibn Arabi understands creation as a result of God's self-manifestation, of God's self-knowledge. The famous Hadith Qudsi, I was an hidden treasure and I long to be known, so I created the world so that I might be known. According to Ibn Arabi, all things which are subsistent in a latent status in God's essence become creation only at the very moment God becomes conscious of them through his self-determination. And Nicholson, one of the greatest scholars on Ibn Arabi's thought, defined the creation of things as meaning that God is knowing such things. So what does this mean? In Ibn Sina's thought, in particular in his elaboration of the Farabian Neoplatonic emanative schema, I'll have it here for you, the understanding and the knowledge that each one of the intellects in the emanatory schema, we have up to 10 intellects, reaching the final intellect, the 10th intellect, which is considered the demiurge of the sublunar realm, of the sublunar world. Each one of these intelligence, by thinking, by becoming aware of its own role in the cosmological schema, and by becoming aware of what has generated it, and becoming aware of its own reality, in a certain way triggers the creation of secondary causes. And I will be just pointing this out very briefly. If we look at the second intelligence, this is just a very schematic presentation of Avicenna's way of looking at the emanatory schema. So according to Ibn Sina, very schematically speaking, the second intelligence has a threefold kind of contemplation. So he has three objects of contemplation. He becomes aware of three things. He becomes aware of what is the cause of its necessitation, the cause of its creation, which is the first intelligence. So by thinking about the first intelligence, he generates, he effuses, he triggers the emanation of the third intellect. But the second intelligence is also thinking about something else. It's thinking about itself as a possible being, something that was only possible of existence and has been granted wujud. And this way of thinking becomes generative of the sphere of the first heaven. But on the other hand, the second intelligence also thinks of itself as a necessary product. And this form of contemplation, this form of awareness, produces the soul of the first heaven. Now, this form of thinking, this threefold way of contemplation, is repeated up to the very last intelligence in the emanatory schema. So what does it mean? To reassume, to make it like, to draw some conclusions, Ibn Sina's way of looking at creation, knowledge becomes the triggers of creation. The intellects know. The intellects think, of course, their nature of intellects necessitates them to think. And this triggers creation. So knowledge, creation are basically combined together. Creation is determined in a way by knowledge. What happens in Ibn Arabi's thought? God's knowledge is dependent on the object of his knowledge, which constitutes you and your essential status. Knowledge has no effect on the object of knowledge, while what is known has an effect on knowledge, bestowing on it of itself what it is. So in Ibn Arabi's understanding, God's knowledge is really determined by the object of his knowledge. It is the ta'ayunat, the ayan thabita, these possible things that are still abintra within his essence, within his absolute unity, that in a way determine what God can know of them. What God's knowledge is determined by the object of his knowledge. And this understanding is fundamental if we look at the definition provided by Ibn Arabi on qada and qadar. Qada, which is usually translated as this divine decree, this pre-eternal plan according to which God predetermines everything that will occur in the world and in other dimension. God's determination of things God is defined as God's determination of things, which is according to what he knows of them in them, since his knowledge of things is dependent on what that which may be known gives to him from what they are eternally in themselves. Is basically stating that the ayan thabita, these eternal archetypes, these forms of possible things, the nature of possible things as being immutable, are dictating what God can know of them. It is the object of God's knowledge that determines God's knowledge. We have the definition of qadar, loosely translated as destiny. And Ibn Arabi translates and interprets this as the precise timing of the manifestation and annihilation of things as they are essentially. For the determiner, in actualizing his determination, complies with the essence of the object of his determination in accordance with the requirements of its essential nature. Here, it is quite clear that Ibn Arabi's thought is very much distant from, for instance, a Ghazalian or an Asharite view of predestination, this idea that God at each moment in time, this occasionalistic way of looking at predetermination, as God being able constantly through takwin to instantiate and annihilate at his please, at his will, whatever enters existence and whatever is predetermined to leave existence. Ibn Arabi's stance is very much more akin to the Avicennan understanding of determinism as a natural determinism. Avicenna speaks of the nature of the essences of the possible beings as secondary causes. It is the nature of things that determines what those things will become. So basically, God knows himself through his names, through his ayam tabita, through his attributes. The attributes are nothing else than the loci manifestationes, the places of disclosure for the divine names. The divine names are contrived, are still embedded in the absolute unity of God, in his wahdiyah, in his status of ultimate unity. So God knows himself through his names only at the very moment they are identified via their respective attributes. And in a way, God's self-knowledge is nothing else than answering the call for the names need to be manifested. The names are still indifferentiated within the divine essence, and they can become known to God in a more detailed way only when they enter existence, only when they are transferred within existence and they found their manifestations as loci theophanici, as loci manifestationes of God in the attributes, in so-called sifat, in the attributes. The definitions of the attributes has been provided to you at the very beginning of this presentation. So what does this mean? It means that God's self-knowledge opens the door for the inner divine potentiality to be disclosed. And this makes knowledge, gnosis, the cause of, let's call it, ontological realization. Now, I am proposing here another passage which I found quite interesting, and this is how Ibn Arabi in the Futuhat, in the third volume of the Futuhat, criticizes in a way both the peripatetic philosophers but also the Neoplatonic philosophers who identified God either as the direct cause of creation or as the cause of the first entified being, i.e. the first intellect of the Neoplatonic emanative schema. And that's what Ibn Arabi states. They, the philosophers, have interpreted the expression the real through which creation occurs in two meanings. Some of them make this real identical with the cause of creation. Those are the peripatetic philosopher, the follower of Aristotle. But the real's creation cannot be assigned a cause. This is what is correct in itself, so much so that in him nothing can be rationally conceived of that would require the causation of this creation of his that becomes manifest. On the contrary, his creation of the creatures is a gratuitous favor towards the creatures and the beginning of bounty, and is independent of the worlds. Others philosophers, make this real to which creation occurs an existent entity through which God created what is apart from him. These are those who say that nothing proceeds from the one, save the one, i.e. the Neoplatonist philosophers, the followers of Neoplatonism, and that the procession of this one is the procession of an effect from a cause that demands that procession. As for this, it is what it is it. As for me, I say, when God's command comes, the commander is the command, and this is the tawhid of him who possesses the command. So associate not, for association is a proven wrongdoing, and so on. So here, Ibn Arabi is basically stating there is no way that we can address God as directly a cause of creation or as directly the cause, as the Musabab al-Asbab, as Ibn Sina would have defined him, the causator of causes. Why? Because if we put God in connection with this creation, we establish a form of necessarily dependence of God with this creation. This was why Arabi was actually also critical of the philosophers' understanding of the eternity of the world. For a philosopher like Ibn Sina, God considered as the cause of creation meant necessarily that the effect of this creation, i.e. the world, was coeternal with God. So philosophers like Ibn Sina were supporting the idea of the eternity of the world. And if we look at the theory of the immutable prototypes of these immutable entities, we might be prone to understand that Ibn Arabi in a certain way espoused this philosopher's understanding of the world as being coeternal with God. God's knowledge is eternal, and of course the object of his knowledge must be eternal as well. But this is not the case. And this is his reply to this problematic of the eternality of the world. How should the cosmos have eternity? It has no entrance into the self-necessity of wujud. The self-necessity of wujud here is, of course, the self-necessity of God as wujud, as the real, as the pure existence. Were eternity affirmed for the cosmos, non-existence would be impossible for it, but non-existence is possible, or rather, it actually happens for all the cosmos. However, most of the servants are uncertain of a new creation. This is, of course, a reference to the Quran, but it is also a reference to Al-Ash'ari's understanding of the doctrine of Takwin. Al-Ash'ari affirmed the renewal of the entities in the accidents, but the philosophers imagined that he was the companion of a disease, so that they considered him ignorant of the black of the Africans and the yellow of gold, and thought that his position had led him astray. Now, William Chittick has analyzed how in Ibn Arabi's thought the two terms illa, which usually is understood as a cause, and ma'lul, so the effect, are actually also translated as a malady and as the infirm. The root of these words are understood by Ibn Arabi to be referring not as to the cause and the effect, but as a reference to a form of malady and a form of infirmity. So when Ibn Arabi is referring to Al-Ash'ari and the philosophers believed him to be the companion of a disease, is basically stating that the philosophers Al-Ash'ari failed to perceive the nature, the essence of things as being causative and of creation, as in the thought of Avicenna. He was not aware of the black of the Africans or the yellow of gold, the nature of these things, and how the nature of these things played a causative role. So here is just a restatement of Ibn Arabi's stress that it is impossible to refer to the real as to be a cause. This would make him would betray his nature as the independent of the world. It is not appropriate that the real's acts be assigned causes, for there is no cause that makes necessary the engendering of a thing save the very wujud of the essence, and the fact that the entity of the possible thing is a receptacle for the manifestation of wujud. Here, once again, there is a very Avicennan understanding of receptivity as being a condition for wujud. Ibn Sina speaks of matter and the receptivity of matter for forms has playing a very important role in the causation of the existential compound, of the material compound. So we know that according to Aristotle, everything that exists is made of matter and form. For Ibn Sina, together with form, even matter played a fundamental role because it's receptive of the form that is assigned to him by the agent intellect. And there is a form of resemblance when Ibn Arabi is basically stating that the possible thing is a receptacle for the manifestation of wujud. It is the possibility, the fact that everything that is receptive of wujud is still a possible thing in itself that makes it as a recipient for existence. So once again, a return to the mumkinat, described also by Ibn Sina. I will just briefly referring to the Ayan Thabit again in order to clarify once again what is Ibn Arabi's understanding of their role in the issue of predestination, or actually determinism. The relation between the Ayan Thabita and the notion of predestination is the focus on the constant changes by which the immutable entities manifest themselves to and through the real. Basically, according to Ibn Arabi, God has described himself to being every day upon some tasks. This is, of course, a Quranic source. But what are these tasks for Ibn Arabi? They are not direct actions of God. It's not God acting directly on existence, but it's basically God deciding, choosing to bestow his manifestation, his forms of manifestations upon the possible of existence, this Ayan Thabita. But of course, on the other end, the Ayan Thabita, so this possible existence that remain, that stay immutable forever, it is their nature, it is the fact that they are mumkinat, this common denominator of the Ayan Thabita as being possible things that make them that in a certain way determine what God can know of them. Do you remember I mentioned that in Ibn Arabi's thought, God's knowledge is basically reliant, is dependent on what is the object of knowledge. So it is truly the nature of the Ayan Thabita, it is the nature of these possible things, immutable things, that determine what God can know of them and what God can choose. Is it God who chooses to transform a possible thing, a mumkinat, and transform it into an existent thing, a mawjudat? Or it is the nature of the Ayan Thabita, the receptacle of existence that informs God of its needs, and God compliantly and in harmony to their nature invests them with wujud. I will conclude my presentation just looking at the concept of servanthood, ubudiyya, and servitude, ubuda. And I will just briefly read through this. To servitude, the servant follows the command without any opposition. When God says to him, be, he comes into existence without hesitation, for there is nothing there but the immutable entity receptive by its very essence to being engendered. Then, when the locus of manifestation is actualized, God says to it, do this and do that. If it disobeys, it is because he is a locus of manifestation, but if he obeys and does not delay, that it is in respect of his immutable entity. So basically, what Ibn Arabi is once again is trying to stress, with reference to the stations of servanthood and servitude, is whilst in the state of servanthood, the servant, the abd, is still in a relationship with himself, because what he perceives as a relation to God is simply a relation to the name Lord that characterizes his essence, and whereas on the other hand, in the state of servitude, the abd is in the absence of any form of relation, either with God or with himself. What really counts for Ibn Arabi is actually the role played by the immutable entities. And when God, in his kun, in his existentiating commands, imposes existence on the immutable entity, this is nothing than the answer to a call by the immutable entity, the possible being's request to be put into existence. Thank you.
May I kick this off? The title was Free Will and Predestination. Normally, we see free will and predestination as mutually exclusive things. Either we are free or we are predetermined. What I get from your presentation is that in Ibn Arabi's thoughts, this mutually exclusive thing is not at all mutually exclusive. In fact, the whole question doesn't make sense anymore if you look at it from his perspective. Is that the case? And
Definitely.
Can you elaborate a bit more on this?
Sure. As I tried to explain, I don't know if it's, the message has reached you in a substantial way, but I think the core of this dilemma, let's say, what is their ikhtiyar, what is their free will, is their predestination, or I've tried to stress in the case of Ibn Arabi is more a form of determinism. I think it's this understanding of determinism, of the essence of the ayan thabita, of these immutable prototypes that really seals the argument. There is no such thing as compulsion, there is no such thing as free will. It is we are what we are thanks to these immutable prototypes that we are nothing than loci manifestationis, than places in which we can according to our nature, to our essence, reflect and manifest only to a certain degree the reality of God. So even when God decides to assign wujud, decides to make a certain possible thing existent, his choice is not really a choice. It's simply answering part of itself and part of his ta'ayunat, part of his being's request to be existentiated. And this can be transferable on the level of determinism. So it is not us being completely free. Our freedom of choice is really determined by who we are, by our possible being.
So, thank you. There are surely more questions here, please. There's one over there.
Hi. I was just thinking the investiture of wujud to the immutable entities, the Ainul Tabita. I don't think that can be a possibility because investiture denotes that if the immutable entity is the Ainul Tabita, there's one and the same as the divine, there can be no investiture.
It is, sorry.
These are one and the same thing. There is no difference between the divine and the immutable entities.
No, that's obviously not the case for Ibn Arabi. God stays God, and the possible things stay the possible things. Either they are invested, let's say, they are given existence or not existence. That's why Ibn Arabi stresses this. Things remain what they are. That's why they're possible beings, always and forever. Even they are granted with this relative reality. We are not talking about a real reality here, a real existence. It's always a form of idafa. It's always a form of metaphorical, let's say, existence. Obviously, through the Wahadat al-Wujud theory, we know that in reality there's nothing but God, there's nothing but the real. So true existence, as in the case of Ibn Sina, it's only pertaining to God. And what we call wujud, with a lowercase w, is a form of, let's say, it's God lending a relative reality. But in truth, there's nothing but He.
Exactly. And the immutable entities, the free will of those are, it is the divine free will.
In the end, that's what it is. Because of this absolute unicity and unity of God. Now, Ibn Arabi speaks of different, in very Neoplatonic terms probably, he speaks of various degree of God's self-disclosure. He speaks of a holy effusion, of extra holy effusion, and it is in a, let's say, in a gradual way that God becomes aware at the different stages of his self-manifestation, that God becomes aware of his names, And only when the names are granted this relative existence that they can become loci theophanici. From names they are turned into the attributes of God, so these places of manifestation for God's self-disclosure. And it is only at the moment when, from a status of possibilities, these ion thabita are granted with this relative existence, let's say, that God becomes aware of them, that God's knowledge is determined by them.
Thank you.
Yes, there are question here and question there.
Hi, obviously this is a very difficult topic to talk about, and I've got a very limited understanding, so I would like to give an example and then maybe kindly ask you to help me understand what Ibn Arabi would response to that would be. So say, for example, I am holding a revolver, a pistol in my hand, and I'm holding it against someone, and I pull the trigger, and the person dies. So there would be now different understandings to that. One might say that person's death was predetermined, so that even if you wouldn't have pulled the trigger, the person would have died anyway because it was the time of his death has come. And another person would say if you wouldn't have pulled the trigger, the person would continue living. Now, if it was predetermined and the person would have died even if I wouldn't have pulled the trigger, so why am I called a murderer then? So what would Ibn Arabi's response to this example be? Because I'm trying to make it more existential than like on a very theoretical basis, just for my own limited understanding.
That's a very difficult, probably the way of Ibn Arabi is looking at this would be not from the Ash'ari perspective, obviously, as you said. He wouldn't consider you to be the cause of the death of the other person by triggering the gun. It would look at your own essence. It would look at your own predisposition, in a way. The predisposition to trigger that thing at a very specific moment, and then causing the annihilation of the other person. So if we read it in terms of the takwin, so the God's intervening in the cessation of existence of that specific person at that specific moment, like an Asharite would do, the reply of Ibn Arabi to that would be that it was your essential reaction, I don't know how to translate this, but your essence that determined for you to take that choice at that specific moment in time. And that specific moment and that choice at that specific moment in time is actually reflective of something that I wouldn't say God would have wanted, because God's willingness, it's very much beyond our parameters. God is actually, in very Ghazalian terms, considered as almost as a compelled chooser. And the compulsion of God to choose something, so in this case probably to allow the murdering of the person, it is not as we perceive it to be. It is something that is a choice that is actually dictated by the response of God to the essential nature that you have. So to your choice, God's reply, God answers your choice by allowing you to do that, without refraining you, because there is not such a predetermination, there is not such a frame, an Asharite frame of predetermination in which any of our actions are actually chosen by God. There is no such thing. There is this conciliation, as Stefan has pointed out. There is this conciliation of free will, dictated by the essence of the person, and on the other hand, God's knowledge of what will happen through the ayan thabita. So God's knowledge that what you've decided to do will happen because it's in accordance to what his own nature dictates. It is a bit complicated.
Sorry, excuse me, there was a question over there first. Then this. Sorry.
What is it?
Up here. Up here. That's it.
Thank you. interested in this question of actualization of possibility. Now, how does Ibn Arabi handle counterfactuals? I mean, for example, instead of coming here, we might have all stayed at home today. Now, what happened to that? I mean, is there sort of another world in which that happened? Or, if not, I mean, how come we can actually sort of think of it or speak of it at all?
I think it goes back again to this ta'ayunat. It speaks of ta'ayunat as predispositions, the receptivity of a being to certain things. So it is probably you all came here today because you're interested in Ibn Arabi, and that's the essence. It is your nature that exposes you, that is your interest in this topic that's actually triggered you to come. So it is your nature that has dictated you to come today.
So the other things
could be a
are
very
not.
simple.
The other thing is not a possibility at all. In fact, it's not actually
There
there.
would have been a possibility. You still remain yourself. Your essence remain. You still have the choice to either have come or not to have come. However, your predisposition, it's an ayan tabda. What does it mean? It's immutable in a way. So this immutability has triggered your interest and your nature to actually come here.
Oh, so I had to come here, basically.
Basically, you had to.
We've got a question over there.
No choice.
Question over there, please.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Just, a question following on the very same discussions, the immutable entities moving from being merely a possible thing into existence. Does God knowledge include knowing which immutable entities, which are purely possible things, mamkunat, will become an existent possible things, as in a'yan thabita mawjudat, that transformation which we determine and ask for it and becomes, does his knowledge know which will move from possibility into existence?
His knowledge is for knowledge, so he would know. His knowledge and foreknowledge are actually one and the same thing in God. And why is that? Because these possible things are immutable, so are the same and will be the same forever and ever. So God's knowledge, which is actually, as I mentioned, dictated by these possible things, is actually knowledge and foreknowledge at the same time. So God will know what possible essence will be actualized in this passage from, let's say, potentiality to actuality, or possibility into necessitation, let's say.
Somebody over here.
Hello, this is Speak. Yeah. I just wanted to ask you something about, it's related to the last question, but the question is, first of all, if the realm of the possible is greater than the realm of the actual, in other words, if the set of possible things is greater than the set of actual things, is it not also true within Ibn Arabi's thought and, within reality, that only those possibilities are possible which are consistent with each other? I'm thinking of the idea that, the laws of mathematics are fundamental to cosmology. Mm-hmm. And there's a statement somewhere in Stephen Hawking's sort of pop writing about that, that there is only one constant in the various equations that describe his cosmology, which does and could have given rise to the universe as it is. If that constant had been different, then everything we know about would not have existed. That suggests that there is a kind of way in which everything has to be consistent with each other, right? And I'm wondering if this is a helpful way of explaining what is often described in theology as the problem of evil. That maybe, this is a big question for me. I think it's a big question for lots of people. Why do lots of aspects of the universe seem to us to be hostile to us, despite a loving divine? Possibly because everything has to be consistent one with each other. And I wonder if you think that is within the scope of the explanations you've given about God's knowledge of the Ain al-Tabita and the way in which his creation is determined by his knowledge of the objects. In other words, by their knowledge, possibly, of what is consistent, one thing with another. Thank you.
Well, it's quite complicated to... with regard to your question, the first question asking whether the mumkinat are the realm of the mumkin, for what I understood, is bigger than the realm of the actual. Well, if for Ibn Arabi everything is existence, if God is truly existence, then probably the answer is no to that. Reality is all-encompassing, so probably no. The second question is not really clear to me. I don't know, is there a way you can reformulate that?
Well, we have got very little time. I think this is a very good moment to end this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.